It started as a routine business trip, just another flight to another city for yet another meeting. I'd flown dozens of times before, but this journey would forever etch itself into the deepest recesses of my memory. The day began uneventfully. I arrived at the airport, dragging my carry-on suitcase through the bustling terminal. The usual sounds of announcements, hurried footsteps, and the occasional child's cry filled the air. I checked in, passed through security, and found my gate. Flight 308 was scheduled to depart at 8:45 p.m., a red-eye flight that promised to be quiet and uneventful. Or so I thought. The boarding process was routine. As I stepped onto the plane, a faint unease settled over me. I shook it off, attributing it to pre-flight jitters. The cabin was dimly lit, and a soft hum of conversation filled the air. I found my seat by the window in row 15. Beside me sat a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who gave me a polite nod. Beyond her, an elderly man was already dozing off. The flight attendants performed their usual safety demonstrations. The engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi down the runway. As we lifted off, the world below shrank into a sea of twinkling lights. I leaned back, closing my eyes, hoping to catch some sleep. It was about an hour into the flight when the first strange thing happened. The cabin lights flickered briefly, plunging us into semi-darkness. The woman beside me glanced up, her brows furrowing. "That's odd," she murmured. I nodded in agreement but didn't think much of it. Planes were complex machines. Minor glitches were bound to happen. The lights stabilized and the flight continued. I settled into my seat, trying to distract myself with an in-flight magazine. The articles were mundane. Celebrity interviews, travel tips, and recipes I'd never try. I flipped through the pages, feeling a growing sense of restlessness. The second incident came not long after. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but his words were distorted, almost as if someone were speaking underwater. "Ladies and gentlemen, DocBot. Please remain seated." The static swallowed the rest of the announcement. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The woman beside me clutched her armrest. "Did he say there's bad weather?" she asked. I shrugged, unsure. Moments later, turbulence struck. The plane jolted violently, and gasps rippled through the cabin. The overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers screamed. My heart pounded as I gripped my seatbelt. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Just turbulence," I muttered, more to myself than to the woman beside me. But the unease gnawed at me. Something didn't feel right. The cabin grew colder. I rubbed my arms, wishing I had brought a jacket. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I noticed a strange smell, faint but unpleasant, like burnt plastic mixed with something metallic. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from the row behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone talking, but the passengers there were asleep. The whispers grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I leaned toward the woman beside me. "Do you hear that?" She looked at me, puzzled. "Hear what?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving me doubting my sanity. I forced a smile and shook my head. Never mind. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. I watched them closely, searching for any signs that they too sensed something was amiss. They moved mechanically, their faces expressionless. When one of them reached our row, I noticed her hands were trembling as she handed me a cup of water. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't respond, her eyes darting around nervously before she hurried to the next row. My unease deepened. Hours passed, or so it seemed. The plane felt trapped in a timeless void. Outside the window, the sky was pitch black. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless expanse of darkness. I'd flown at night before, But this felt different. Oppressive. The elderly man in the aisle seat began to stir. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural. He turned to look at me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "They're coming," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he slumped back in his seat, his breathing Ow! The woman beside me looked at him, then at me. "What did he say?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure. Something about someone coming." Her face paled. "This is getting weird, really weird." As if on cue, the plane shuddered again. This time, the turbulence was more violent. The overhead bins flew open and luggage spilled into the aisle. The lights flickered wildly, then went out entirely. Panicked cries filled the cabin. In the darkness, the whispers returned, louder now, insistent. They seemed to echo inside my head, growing more frantic with each passing second. "Make it stop!" someone screamed. I wasn't sure if it was a passenger or me. The plane's emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and then I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct but menacing. They moved down the aisle, their presence freezing the air. Passengers screamed, but the sound seemed muffled, as if we were underwater. The figures passed through seats, their translucent forms defying logic. One stopped beside me. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void, an emptiness that seemed to pull at my very soul. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me felt like ice. It reached out, its hand, a skeletal, shadowy thing, hovering inches from my face. Time seemed to slow, my vision blurred, and a deafening roar filled my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The figures vanished, the cabin lights flickered back to life. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. The air was thick with the smell of fear. The captain's voice came over the intercom, clearer this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." His calm tone was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd just endured. I turned to the woman beside me. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Was that?" she whispered. I had no answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, I knew there was no rational explanation. This was no ordinary flight. We were caught in something far beyond our understanding, and it wasn't over. The rest of the flight became a blur. People sat rigidly in their seats, afraid to move or speak. Every noise, every flicker of light sent a ripple of panic through the cabin. The flight attendants, those who hadn't vanished during the chaos, moved like ghosts themselves, their eyes hollow and their movements stiff. I tried to focus on my breathing, willing myself to stay calm. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence was almost worse. Outside the window, the darkness pressed against the glass, unyielding and infinite. "Do you think we're still on Earth?" the woman beside me asked in a shaky voice. I turned to her, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the window. "It's just dark. There's nothing out there. No stars, no lights, nothing. It's like we're floating in a void." I wanted to dismiss her fears, to reassure her that everything was fine. But I couldn't, because deep down, I felt it too, the unsettling sensation that we were no longer in the world we knew. The elderly man stirred again. His eyes fluttered open, and he sat upright with a suddenness that made me jump. He stared straight ahead, his lips moving silently. Sir?" I ventured, leaning toward him. "Are you okay?" He turned to me slowly, his gaze piercing. "It's not over," he said. his voice low and hoarse. "He'll be back." Before I could respond, the plane lurched violently, throwing me against my seatbelt. Screams erupted once more as the cabin plunged into chaos. This time the lights didn't just flicker. They went out completely, leaving us in pitch darkness. And then from the depths of the plane came a sound that made my blood run cold. A deep, guttural growl. Unlike anything I'd ever heard, it was followed by a scraping noise, as if something heavy was being dragged along the floor. "What is that?" the woman beside me whispered, clutching my arm. I shook my head, too terrified to speak. The growls grew louder, closer. Shadows moved in the darkness, shifting and writhing like living things. A cold wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it the stench of decay. And then they returned. The figures emerged once more, their forms more defined this time. They were tall and thin, their limbs elongated and twisted. Their faces, if you could call them that, were featureless voids, blacker than the surrounding darkness. They moved with unnatural grace, gliding down the aisles as passengers cowered in their seats. One of them stopped beside the elderly man. He looked up at it, unafraid. "I knew you'd come back," he said softly. The figure reached out, its hand passing through his chest. He gasped, his body convulsing, and then he was gone. Not dead. Gone. His seat was empty, as if he had never been there. The woman beside me let out a strangled sob. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" The figure turned toward us. I froze, unable to look away from its void-like face. It raised a hand, reaching for me. "No!" I screamed, squeezing my eyes shut. When I opened them, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on, revealing a cabin full of terrified passengers. But the elderly man was nowhere to be seen. His seatbelt hung loosely, the only evidence he had ever been there. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." I stared at the speaker in disbelief. Descent? To where? The woman beside me grabbed my hand. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "We can't stay on this plane." Her words echoed the fear in my heart. But there was no escape. We were trapped, hurtling through a void toward an unknown destination. And whatever waited for us at the end of this flight, I knew it would be worse than anything we had faced. So it was a chilly morning when I boarded the plane, my heart a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was my first flight ever, and I could hardly believe it was happening. As I walked through the narrow aisle, the hum of the engines filled my ears, and the smell of recycled air mixed with faint hints of coffee and jet fuel surrounded me. I found my seat by the window, just as I had requested when booking the ticket. It was the perfect spot for someone like me, who had always dreamt of flying, but had never experienced it. I placed my small backpack under the seat in front of me and buckled my seatbelt as the flight attendant instructed. The plane was a hive of activity. Passengers were settling in, overhead compartments being shut, and children's laughter mingling with the soft murmur of conversations. I gazed out of the window. The airport was bustling with activity, baggage carts zipping around, planes taxiing to the runways, and workers in reflective vests moving with purpose. Everything looked so organized yet chaotic at the same time. "This is your captain speaking," came a calm voice over the intercom. "We'll be taking off shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are stowed. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." My palms were slightly sweaty as the plane began to move. Slowly at first, it taxied to the runway. Then came the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating. The engines roared to life, growing louder and more powerful with every passing second. The force pushed me back into my seat as the plane sped down the runway. My heart raced, and for a split second I thought I might faint. And then, just like that, we were airborne. I felt an odd sense of weightlessness as the plane climbed higher and higher into the sky. The city below grew smaller, the buildings turning into tiny specks, and the cars looking like ants crawling along invisible roads. Soon we were above the clouds. They stretched out like a soft, endless carpet of white, glowing under the morning sun. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. As the plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign turned off with a ding, and the flight attendants began their service. The hours in the day had closed their anchors on me, but they were visible through the open private plane where guards lay around. I ordered a cup of tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. Sipping it slowly, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The anxiety I had felt earlier seemed almost silly now. Flying wasn't as scary as I had imagined. It was exhilarating. I spent most of the flight glued to the window, watching the world from a perspective I had only seen in movies or pictures. The mountains looked majestic, their snow-capped peaks piercing through the clouds. Rivers snaked their way through valleys, and forests appeared as lush green patches. Time seemed to blur as I lost myself in the beauty of it all. But then, as with all things, the flight began to wind down. The captain announced our descent, and the plane started to lower gradually. My ears popped, and I swallowed hard to ease the discomfort. The clouds that had seemed so far below were now beside us, and the ground grew closer with every passing minute. Landing was smoother than I had expected. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and soon we were taxiing to the gate. My heart swelled with a mix of relief and accomplishment. I had done it! I had flown for the first time, and it had been an unforgettable experience. As I walked off the plane and into the terminal, I couldn't stop smiling. Flying had opened up a whole new world for me, one filled with endless possibilities and destinations waiting to be explored. I knew this was just the beginning of many adventures to come. Later that evening, as I sat in my hotel room, I thought about the journey. I couldn't help but replay every moment in my mind, from the roaring engines to the serene clouds. It felt surreal, almost like a dream. I wrote down every detail in my journal, wanting to preserve the memory forever. The next morning, I ventured out to explore the city. The vibrant streets, the smell of freshly baked bread from nearby cafes, and the friendly faces of locals, all added to the excitement of my trip. I realized how much I had been missing by staying in my comfort zone all these years. Flying had not only shown me a new perspective of the world, but also a new perspective of myself. I felt braver, more curious, and ready to embrace whatever came next. The experience had sparked a hunger for adventure that I knew would never fade. As I sat on a park bench watching people go about their day, I made a promise to myself. I would travel more, see more, and live more. The world was vast and full of wonders, and I wanted to experience it all. My first flight was just the beginning, and I couldn't wait for the journeys yet to come. The following weeks were filled with more flights, each one unique and thrilling in its own way. I traveled to a bustling metropolis, where the skyscrapers seemed to touch the heavens, and the streets buzzed with endless energy. I found myself wandering through ancient ruins in a desert city, imagining the stories of those who had lived there centuries ago. I trekked through a misty forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and the sound of birdsong. With each new destination, I met people from different walks of life. There was Maria, a cheerful artist who painted breathtaking landscapes inspired by her travels. She shared her stories with me over coffee in a quaint European town. Then there was Hassan, a passionate historian who brought the past to life with his vivid descriptions of ancient battles and lost civilizations. I even made friends with a fellow traveler, Elena, who was as curious and eager to explore the world as I was. Together, we ventured into hidden corners of the cities we visited, discovering little-known gems that weren't in any guidebook. One memorable flight took me to a tropical paradise. The view from the plane as we descended was stunning. turquoise waters, white sandy beaches, and lush green islands scattered across the sea. I spent days exploring coral reefs, swimming alongside vibrant fish, and hiking up to breathtaking viewpoints. The sunsets there were unlike anything I had ever seen, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple. But not all my flights were smooth. There were moments of turbulence that rattled my nerves, times when delays left me stranded in unfamiliar airports, and a particularly nerve-wracking landing during a storm that made me appreciate the skill of pilots even more. Yet, even these challenges became stories to tell and lessons to learn. As I traveled, I noticed how each flight taught me something new. Flying wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a metaphor for life. There were takeoffs, full of energy and anticipation, cruising moments where I could relax and reflect, and landings that reminded me to stay grounded. I learned to embrace the journey, no matter how bumpy it might be. Years later, as I look back on that very first flight, I realized how much it had changed me. What had started as a nervous leap into the unknown had transformed into a lifelong passion for exploration. I had seen so many incredible places, met countless fascinating people, and gathered memories that would stay with me forever. Even now, every time I board a plane and hear the engines roar to life, I feel that same spark of excitement. The sky is a limitless canvas, and the world below holds endless adventures. My first flight was the beginning of a story that continues to unfold, one chapter at a time.